Welcome back. As we move further into VBA, we'll need VBA to be able to remember things. So we're going to be starting to use what's called variables. Variables are small pockets of computer memory used to store and retrieve information. We can use them to store numbers or text or ranges of cells, charts, or pretty much anything. You're going to want to open up the file called Simple Variables. And once you open that up, make sure to also get open the Visual Basic window, and you'll see that there are a number of macros already created in here. Now, if I wanted to be able to retrieve certain information from another location, or retrieve certain information that I've stored in VBA and be able to use it here in my interface, I'm going to need to use a variable to do that. And here's how they work. First of all, we need to list exactly what kind of a variable this is. Notice the beginning of this statement starts with the letters DIM. That stands for declared in memory. And this is how we tell VBA that we're going to be using the next word as a variable. This is essentially a pocket or a bowl or a backpack or something like that, something that's going to be able to temporarily store a bit of information. And then we need to explain for VBA what kind of content is going to go in there. In this case, I'm saying integers are going to go in there. That's all that's going to go in there. And that's going to make it easy for VBA to keep that data size an appropriate size. In this case, the integer size is rather small, and so I like to specify for VBA that it's going to be small. In this case, I actually assigned a number here. So I've already told VBA that I'm going to create this pocket. It's called a number. And now I'm going to give it a value. So I'm saying this thing that I made called a number, this little pocket, that's going to hold the value of 2 for now. And then in this third little bit here, I've actually assigned a task for this. I've said, okay, I have a cell range A5, and the value of that range I want to be specific stored value. And if I run this macro here, you'll see that over here, the value of that cell has now changed. Now, of course, the formatting here needs to be changed back to something like general for me to actually see the number 2. Or if I change that to a date format, of course, it looks a little silly. But if I wanted it to be January 2nd, 1900, I would have exactly what I wanted. All right, we're going to keep going. The next few examples are mostly for practice for you. In the next example, we're actually storing date values. This is an example of a date variable. So we're saying this is going to be a variable called a date, and the data type is going to be a date data type. Then we actually assign a value. We say, okay, this thing that we made called a date, we're going to grab the content from E1. Now, E1 is located right up here, and that happens to have a date in it. And so this is appropriate. I've stored this as a date data type, and now it's going to store dates. What you don't want to do is store variables as the wrong data type. Now, there are lots of different data types for variables. You want to make sure to use the right kind of data type when you are creating a variable. If you're going to be using text, use text. If you're going to be using numbers, use numbers. And if you're going to be using true or false, make sure to use the Boolean data type. This is a list of common data types that you'll want to be aware of. Numerical data types include the decimal data type, which is not the smallest data type you can have, but it does allow you to have decimal placeholders, which is nice if you're going to be doing calculations with many decimals. The double data type is for relatively simple numbers, something with not too many decimal placeholders. And then you have the integer data type, which doesn't allow any decimal placeholders whatsoever. You'll see as they're allowed to be more and more simple, they take up less and less space, integer only taking up 2 bytes. There are many different kinds of text data types. The first one I've listed here is called variant. Now, variant doesn't actually need to be text. Variant can hold anything, which is why it's called variant. That's also why it's so big. So you'll want to make sure not to use variant unless you really truly don't know what kind of data is going to need to be housed in there eventually. The most common text data type is the string data type. The size of that variable does depend on the amount of content that you're storing there, so keep that in mind. It can hold quite a bit of content, but it can also take up a bit of space if it holds a lot of content. And then you have the char or char data type that handles mostly smaller sets of information. We also have the Boolean and byte data types. Boolean only handles true or false, which makes it relatively small, only 2 bytes. And then we have the smallest of them all, the byte data type, which only takes up 1 byte and can only hold values from 0 to 255. And then we have a group of miscellaneous data types. Here we have the date data type that we just saw an example a moment ago. We have object data types that can hold things like charts. And then we have the range data type, which you may have seen in an example earlier, which actually remembers ranges of cells in your workbook. Coming back in our document here, you'll see that if you scroll down a little bit, there is a macro called string variable. This is an example where you can practice creating a string variable. I'm going to do it really quick, and then you can do it on your own. I'm going to start by declaring my variable with the dim as statement, what's referred to as the dim as. Of course, DIM stands for declared in memory. So I'm going to name this a product as string. And that's going to let VBA know that the only kind of content that's going to be stored here is string content. Now I'm actually going to place some data inside of my variable by saying my variable that I've named a product, that should hold the information that's in cell G3. So I'm going to say range G3. The value that's in that range should be stored in my variable called a product. And now I'm going to actually use that content. Now that it's remembered that content, I'm later going to be able to use it. And let's say later on in cell B5, I'm going to want to be using that content, a product. And if I run this macro here that I've created, you'll see that it puts in the name of that particular product there. It just so happens that I need to make this column a little bit bigger. There we go. And now I can see the entire name. All right, so the rest of the variables that are in this worksheet are for you to practice on. Here's a number variable. If you scroll down, you'll see an example where you can get your variable to increase in value. And then at the bottom, there is a macro that is designed to run all of the above variables. There is a little bit of lingo in here called a call statement. We are going to be talking about that later on, so if you don't feel completely comfortable with it yet, don't worry about it. We're going to cover it. Go ahead and pause the video. Come on back when you're done. There are a couple other things that we want to know about variables before we go and start using them in our VBA language. And here's what they are. There is a naming convention for variables, and there's certain ways to treat them. First of all, this dim as statement is not actually necessary. However, if you don't include the dim as statement, then the data type that gets assigned to that variable is the variant data type, which, as we learned earlier, is pretty byte expensive. So we want to avoid that. And so that's why we tend to put the dim as statement at the beginning of all of our variable names. Now, you can force people to put in the dim as statement at the beginning of all of their variables. And the way that we do that is with an option explicit statement at the very top of our macro code. So you can go all the way to the top of your macro code above your sub statement and type in option explicit. And that's going to make sure that people have to declare their variables. They can't just go making any variable that they want whenever they want by saying like, this is a variable, and just using it, okay? So we want to make sure that we do have dim as statements, and we're going to use the option explicit at the top of our code in order to make sure people do that. The other thing that we want to be aware of is that there is a naming convention for our variables. They have to start with a letter, they can't have any spaces, and they need to have 255 characters or fewer. I'll give us an example. So here's an example of an inappropriately named variable. I have a space. And the moment I try and execute that variable, it says, you can't do that. Okay, so no spaces inside of our variable names. Also, it needs to start with a letter. If I accidentally put a number as the beginning, watch what happens. So it doesn't accept that either. And the third thing we want to be mindful of when we're naming our variables is not to name them after a existing property method active sheet here. Now watch what happens. When I hit enter, it actually lets me name it that, and then I can store information inside of this variable type, for instance, and then I can use that later on. I'll say I want to assign cell A1 as the value of what I've put inside that variable. And if I run this right now, it actually inserts that numerical value there. So it worked as a storage space. However, later on, if I decide to use this particular variable, and I actually want to use the object that it's named after, maybe I want to rename my sheet here at the end. I want to rename my sheet. This won't work. And now I want to run my code. It says, oh, I can't do that. So we also don't want to name our variables after any existing objects, properties, or methods. And if we stick to those guidelines, we're going to be safe with our variables. In this last example, we were able to get VBA to fetch information about a particular product and populate it on our list on the left-hand side. However, if we wanted to do that for many different products, it would start to become rather time-consuming to do that within VBA unless we started to incorporate what's called a loop. And that would be able to populate information for multiple different products. In order to do that, you're going to want to open up a file called forNext. The forNext loop is going to be the file that we're working on next. There are a few different kinds of loops within VBA, but we're going to be focusing on two different kinds, the forNext loop and the do loop. We're starting with the forNext loop. Go ahead and open up this file called forNext loop on the left-hand side, and then the VBA window associated with it on the right-hand side. You'll see that there's already some code in here that's populated for you, and you can use it to follow along with me. I'm going to create mine from scratch. Now, loops do require us to create a variable. ForNext loops are the first kind of loop that we're going to be talking about, and what they do is they loop through a certain process a specific number of times, meaning you tell it how many times to go through this particular process. If I wanted to, I could say, I want it to happen 10 times, or happen 100 times, or something like that. I'm going to need to declare a variable here because eventually I'm going to want my loop to happen across all of these different rows in this green area on the left-hand side of our document. So I'm going to create a variable called x, and I'm going to make it an integer variable because eventually it's going to be representing row numbers, and my row numbers are only ever integers. A basic forNext loop starts with the for statement, and then you declare exactly what the value of your variable should be. So I'll say for x equaling 1 to 10. That means that this loop is going to happen when x is equal to 1. It'll happen when x is equal to 2. It'll happen when x is equal to 3, to 4, to 5, to 6, and every single possibility in between. Now, I've already declared that x is an integer, which means that it can only happen when it's equal to 1 or 2 or 3. It cannot do 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, or anything like that. So in this case, x is only going to equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, or 10. Meaning, this loop is going to happen 10 times altogether. Now, what I want to eventually loop is the process by which I'm going to insert the value of 100 into each one of these cells. And so I'm going to use the code that says cells, and I'm going to start with cell 1, 1, that's cell A1 as we know it. And then I'm going to say, I want that to have a value of 100. Now, if I executed this right now, well, it would have a problem because I've started a for loop without the end of it. But if I were just to execute this one little statement that says this cells line right here, the value of 100, all it would do is input that value into cell A1. But I want this to repeat every single time. So when x equals 1, I want it to be in row 1. When x equals 2, I want it to be in row 2. When x equals 3, I want it to be in row 3. And so instead of actually putting the number of the rows here, what I can do is simply say x. Because then when x equals 1, the row will be 1 as well. When x equals 2, the row will be 2 as well, etc. And I have to end my for next loop with a next statement. This is my ending bookend that basically says to go back to the beginning and start the next loop for the next value of x. And if I execute this, it happens too fast for me to watch, but the value of 100 got inserted into each one of these cells. Go ahead and give that a try on your own and come on back. In the last example, I was very easily able to populate this entire column of information an exact number of times exactly as I wanted. However, if I wanted to populate the next column over, I'm going to have a little bit of difficulty because the way that my macro code is set up is to automatically presume that I'm only going to operate in column 1 here, where it says column 1. Watch what happens if I change this to x. If I think maybe I can get the next column over to happen and the next column after that and the next column after that and all the way through the 10 columns after that, when I hit play, watch. When x is equal to 1, it populates A1. When x is equal to 2, it only populates B2. When x is equal to 3, only C3, etc. So that's not exactly what I want to be able to do here. I want to be able to populate more columns of information right here. And I want to have that value that I'm looking for populated across those rows. If you want to be able to populate multiple columns or multiple rows with the same for next loop, you're going to need to create what's called a double for next loop, which is basically nesting one inside the other. It's not as complicated as it sounds. We're going to start by declaring 2 variables this time, one for each of the for next loops that we're going to be creating. I'm going to start creating my variables with a very specific name like intcol. int for integer and col as the name of what it's eventually going to fill, which is the column in this case. And I'm going to say this is an integer variable, and I'll create one more for rows. Now that I've declared my variables, I can go ahead and make my for next statement. So I'll start with my for, and I'll say when int call is equal to 1 through 3. Okay, so I want 3 columns of information populated here. Okay, when it's equal to 1 through 3, well then, my cells, I'll just start with the basics here. I want the value to say something like, wow, this works. And then, of course, I'll have to end this next statement by saying next int call. However, if I were to try and add that second axis onto my for next loop, I'm going to need to add a secondary for next loop inside of the one that I already have. So I'm going to start by placing my cursor at the end of the previous for, and I'm going to make another one. For int row, and I'll say I want this to happen for 10 rows altogether, so 1 to 10. Now the trick with nesting one for next loop inside of another is that whichever one is on the inside has to be on the inside in both cases, during the for statement and the next statement. So I'm going to make sure that my next statement for my row is on the inside as well. And I'll say next int row. Now, of course, this is only going to work for cell A1 at this point, unless I specify for my cells object that when int row equals 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, etc., that I want that to get populated. And when the column equals 1 or 2 or 3, that gets populated. And here we go. Let's test it out. That's pretty cool. Give it a shot yourself and come on back. And now we're going to take the idea of a double for next loop and turn it into a triple for next loop. So The double was able to populate information down a column and across a row and create basically a table of information for us. But what if we wanted to do this over multiple different sheets? You could basically add a third dimension to your for next loop and be able to do that. It's going to require the exact same principles that we learned in the double for next loop. So I'm going to declare 3 different variables this time. One for columns, one for rows, and one for sheets. Then I'm going to put in the beginning of my for statements. So I'm going to start with my for statement for the sheet. And I want this to happen on this sheet and the following 2 sheets. This one happens to be number 3 in the order of all the sheets in the workbook. So I'm going to say 3 to 5. And then I'm going to start my for next loop for the columns. And I want that to happen over 3 columns. And then my rows. And then the actual code that I want to execute, I am going to need to be specific enough to say exactly which worksheet I want this to execute on. But lucky for me, my variable is going to determine that for me. And then I'll do the same code that we had last time, which is the cells using the variables. And then I'll input a value there of neat. And I'm going to have to finish out my next statements. They are going to have to be in reverse order of the for statements, just like we saw last time. And assuming I've spelled all my variables correctly, I should be able to press play, and then of course it happens on this sheet, on the next sheet, and on the sheet after that. A for each loop is a for next loop, but it operates on entire collections. So in this case, we have a collection of worksheets in this workbook. Altogether, they make up the collection called worksheet. And so if I have something that's a collection like worksheets, then I can say I want to do this particular thing to every single thing in that particular collection. I'm going to go ahead and establish a variable just as we have before, except I'm going to say that this is actually a worksheet here, and we will be talking about the worksheet object and the worksheet collection later on in this course. But if I wanted to use the for each loop to do this, it would look like this. For each x, in the collection called worksheets. And maybe in this case, I just want to get a nice little message box to pop up. And we're going to be covering message boxes later on in this course as well. But maybe I want it to tell me exactly what the name of that particular worksheet is. And I'll concatenate this with x, which is my variable, and the name of that particular worksheet. And then I'll finish out this with my next statement. Okay, so it's finding each one of these worksheets and telling me exactly what the name is because that's what I've asked it to do. So it's going to operate this particular for next statement for every single one of the items, every single one of the worksheets in this case, in the collection called worksheets. Go ahead and give that a shot and come on back. And finally, the last of the for next statements we're going to cover is the one that actually requires an exit for statement. The exit for statement is used to exit the for next loop prior to the actual ending statement. Okay, so if you have a clause in here that would require you to exit the loop early, that's what the exit for statement is used for. Now, in this example, we're actually going to be utilizing an if-then statement, which is something we're going to be covering later on in the course. So just go ahead and bear with me while we check out the example of this. I'm going to declare my variable as normal. I'm going to use x, and that's going to be an integer, of course. And I'll say for x equals 1 to 50. Forgot my equal sign. There we go. All right, and I'm going to say that I want to select range b something. And the row that's going to be determined here is going to be based on whatever my variable is at the moment. So when it goes through this the first time, I want to be on B1. When it goes through it the second time, I want to be on B2. When it goes through it the third time, I want to be on B3. So I am going to use my variable to determine that. And then I'm going to select that cell, and I'm going to input a particular value if the word doesn't say stop. If the word stop is not already populated in that cell. So I'm going to put a little test in here. It's basically going to say, do this, keep doing this forever, unless you actually run into a value that's already in that cell that says stop. And this is what that statement would look like. Keep in mind, we haven't talked about the if-then statement yet, so don't worry about completely feeling comfortable with this. Unless that cell says stop, in which case, exit my for statement. And that's what the exit for looks like. Now, in the case that it doesn't say stop, I do want it to continue going, so I'm going to use an else-if statement. And again, we are going to cover this later, so don't worry about it too much right now. And if it doesn't say the word stop, then I want it to populate the word info over and over and over again. So we're going to be saying, if it says stop, then exit the for statement. Otherwise, if it's empty, then put in the word info. And we'll cover this later, but I do have to put in an end if. And then, of course, like we are used to, I do need to put in my next statement to finish out my for next loop. And then when I go ahead and play this, the word info gets populated over and over and over again until it runs into a cell that already has the value of stop. Go ahead and give this a shot for yourself and come on back, and then we'll move on to other kinds of loops. In the last video, we saw an example of a loop that was going to perform its action over and over and over again unless some kind of a logical test was performed. And if that test equivocated to true, then the loop would stop itself prematurely. That was the exit for statement that allowed us to do that. But let's say we wanted to be able to create a loop whose sole job wasn't to do that loop a certain number of times like the for loop, but maybe what it was supposed to do is simply perform its task ad infinitum until some particular criteria was met. That's what we call a do loop. Now, there are a few different kinds of do loops that we're going to be exploring. We're going to start with the do while loop. This loop performs its action over and over and over again while a particular criteria is met. Another way of phrasing this is to say that it performs its loop over and over again while a certain test equals true. The moment that test equals false is when the loop actually stops itself. So if you open the file called do loop, on the very first sheet there, which is called the do while loop, open up your Visual Basic for Applications interface, and you'll see on the right-hand side that there are already some macros in here that are designed for you to be able to follow along. I'm going to remove the code within my macro so that we can go ahead and do it together. In this first example, what we're going to be doing is asking Visual Basic to perform a particular task a certain number of times. We're going to be asking it to perform this particular task while x is less than 10. In this case, we're going to be establishing a variable just like we did with the for next loop. So I'm going to say dim x as integer. And this is a do while loop. So I'm going to say do while x is less than a value of 10. Now, I'm going to be using cells again to refer to each cell reference. And I'm going to be saying while the row is a numerical value of 1 or 2 or 3 or anything less than 10, I want it to select that particular row and stay in column 1 and put a value in there of, let's say, cool. Here's the neat thing about the do loop. Now what I'm going to say is the new x equals x plus 1. And with that, the value of x is actually increasing. Now, I do need to put a beginning value of x, so I'm going to go ahead and do that here at the beginning. I'm going to say x starts as a value of 1. And then it goes through this loop. The last thing that it does in the middle of this loop is to add 1 to its own value, thereby increasing its value by 1 each time. And now I'm going to close out the loop by putting the word loop at the end. And let's run it. And there we go. Go ahead and do that for yourself and come on back, and we'll look at the do while not empty. In this next example, we're going to be manufacturing our own do while not empty loop. So I'm going to start just as I did before by declaring a variable. And I'm going to start with the value of 5 because I want my loop to actually start on row 5. I'm going to start by using the do while loop. And I'm going to say do while the cell, the value of that cell is not, that's what those two operators next to each other mean there, is not empty. And by putting those two quotation next to each other, we are basically saying empty. All right? And then on the next line, I'm actually going to say what I want to happen in the loop. So while there's stuff in here, I want it to perform the loop until it's empty. This is a process by which you can basically have the autofill handle operate. Like you can imagine an autofill handle operating if you were to do this in Excel and you were to double click on the autofill handle and it populates to the bottom of a data set, right? Well, that's basically what we're going to be manufacturing here. So we're going to be watching the column to the left, and we're going to be performing the following bit of code while the columns adjacent to it are filled with contents. So I'll say cells X3, that means whatever iteration of the loop we're on, and in column 3, and the value of that should be whatever comes from the column to the left of it, and I'm going to say plus 30 days. And that way I'm going to be using the dates on the left-hand side and adding 30 days to populate a column of information about the due dates for these particular items. And then, of course, I'm going to end my do loop by saying, okay, the next x equals x plus 1. I'm going to finish that out with the loop bookend, and here we go. Now I have all my due dates. Give it a shot yourself and come on back. And now it would be helpful for us to be able to learn how to do a do loop that instead of performing a loop while a certain criteria equivocates to true, maybe we want to have a do loop that performs its action until a criteria equivocates itself to true. That's what a do until loop is going to do. So I'm going to start off by determining my variable again. So I'm going to call this one int row. This is going to be my integer. And I'll start off with a value of 1 for that. And then here's how the do until works. Do until, and then you put whatever criteria needs to equivocate to true for this loop to stop itself. Now there's this really neat little clause that you can put in here, which is called isEmpty. And basically what it does is it performs a logical test to see if a particular cell is empty. All you have to do is specify which cell, and I'll just say cells int row. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is I'm performing a logical test to see, is this cell empty? If this cell is not empty, it's going to continue the loop. If that criteria does equivocate to true, in this case, this cell is empty, then it will actually stop looping. So here we go. Let's finish this out. I'll say, in the case that it is not empty, I want you to change the value of the cell to info. And then I do need to, like normal with the do loops, I do need to increase the value of the next loop around. So there I go, applying my step value. Then I'm going to finish this out with the loop. And here we go. That is the do until loop, which performs its action until a particular test equivocates to true. In this case, until a cell is empty. And there's one more iteration of the do until loop, which we call the do loop until. This sort of depends on your personal preference. Whichever one makes more sense to you is the one that you should utilize. There's not a whole lot of situations in which you would need to use one rather than the other. However, it is pretty cool to go over. So let's talk about it. Instead of saying do until, we're going to say do. And then way down farther, we're going to say loop until. Okay, so here's how it's going to look. I do need to declare my variable, of course, and I need to determine exactly which value that should start on. And then I'm going to say what I want it to do over and over again. I'll choose the same word for this example. And then I'll have it step up its value for the next time around. And then here's my loop until, and now I put my logical test here at the end. So this is just another option for you. Give that one a shot. And the real test is to see which one you like better. Some people like this one, some people like the one that we did before. You decide, and whichever one you like better is the one that you should carry along with you. Now that we know how to create loops, we're probably going to want to start to be able to generate reports based on content that's already in our workbook. In order to do so, we're going to need to know a few basic vocab terms in VBA, and then we'll be able to really easily begin to code report generators. A few bits of vocab that we're going to need to cover in this section is worksheets, including the following. Worksheets.count, that might count the number of worksheets that's in my workbook. And I could ask the question of the immediate window, how many worksheets are in my workbook? Turns out that there are 5. So I just used the worksheets object and the count method in order to be able to determine that. I can also use the offset method, which allows me to navigate from a given cell into other cells. For instance, if I take the cell that I've already selected, and then I put in an offset method, I can then specify where I want to move from the given cell. You can see that I've started by entering in the word selection. That's going to take into account the cell that I've already selected and offset from there, which means that I'm going to travel in a certain direction. Now, the offset allows me to determine, first of all, how many rows I want to travel downward or upward if I use a negative number. And then secondarily, it allows me to determine how many columns I'm going to move over to the right or left if I use a negative number there. In this case, if I use a 1, 0, that is indicating that I want to move 1 row down and 0 columns left or right, and then I will select that. And if I execute that in the immediate window, see, my cell moves down 1. I had some content in that particular cell that I wanted to be able to copy and paste in another location. I could simply say selection.copy, and then I could say selection.offset. I'm going to move down. And then I can say ActiveSheet.paste. Now, the copy and paste is a little bit tricky. The copy is easy, but the paste is a little bit difficult. When it comes to pasting, you can't actually paste in a range. If you wanted to paste in a range, you need to use the paste special option. The paste method is only a method of the ActiveSheet object, and so keep that in mind. You are going to want to mention ActiveSheet.paste if you want to use paste, or if you wanted to use range or something else of the sort, you want to use paste special, like so. That's what paste special looks like. Of course, it doesn't apply to ActiveSheet, but nonetheless, that's what it looks like. All right, keeping into account all of these terms, we can very easily create a report generator. In this document here, this document called Worksheets, Count, Offset, and Copy, we're going to be able to exemplify all of the above, also including a simple for next loop. This is going to be a precursor to the following exercise, which is going to be a little bit more challenging and take into account everything that we've learned so far in this particular class. All right, so in this particular document, the last sheet is called P&L, which of course stands for profit and loss. And let's say, for instance, I want to be able to copy the information from all my other sheets. I have sources of revenue, other income, expenses, and taxes, and I want to be able to place them all on my profit and loss sheet at the very end. In order to do that, I'm going to need to create a loop that determines exactly how many sheets I have in my workbook, and then is able to iterate that loop to copy and paste content from each given sheet the appropriate number of times depending on how many sheets I actually have in that workbook. So I'm going to start by declaring a couple of variables. So I'm going to use x. This is going to be used for my for next loop. And I'm going to say dim x as integer, as we were doing with our for next loops previously. I'm also eventually going to want to save these sheet names from each of these sheets so that I can put a nice little label on my profit and loss statement right above where I'm going to paste the content from that particular sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable whose sole job is to remember the sheet titles. And those sheet titles are going to be stored as text, so I'm calling that a string variable. And I'm going to start my for next loop. For x equals 1, 2. Now I could say 5 or 4 rather, because I want this to iterate 4 times. I have 5 sheets in total, but I don't want this to iterate for my profit and loss statement. So I'm going to say for x equals 1 to 4. But let's say, for instance, in the future, I might add other expenses or I might add other sheets into this workbook. I want it to be able to be rather flexible in that case. And so I'm going to have VB figure out what the count is of my worksheets. And then because I don't want this to happen on the very last sheet, I only want this to iterate the total number of sheets except for this last one. I'm going to say worksheets.count minus 1 to account for this last one. I don't want it to happen for the 5th sheet. This is my final sheet here. All right, and then each time it goes through this loop, I want it to grab the given worksheet for x. This time it will grab sheet 1, and it will select it. And then I want it to immediately store the sheet title. That's that variable that I created just to remember the sheet title of the active sheet. And the way that I do that is by saying ActiveSheet.name, and that's going to store the name of that particular active sheet. We learned how to use the name method earlier. And then finally, I'm going to go to the last sheet in here, which is called Worksheets. It's called P&L. And I'm going to select it. Once there, I'm going to start with range A1. That's going to be a safe place to start. But from there, I'm going to need to offset or move down a certain number of rows. And I know that the amount of content that I generally tend to keep on these sheets is about 4 rows or so of information. So I'm just going to say selection.offset to move down to account for the content that maybe I've already placed in there. So I'll say offset a certain number of times. Now, if I just said offset 5 rows or something like that, went to go paste the content from the second sheet, it would paste it over the content from the first sheet. So I'm going to say, instead of just counting 5 rows, I want you to multiply x times 5. So the first time this goes through, it will offset by 5 rows. And the second time it goes through, it will offset by 10 rows. And the third time it goes through, it will offset by 15 rows. Now, it's not actually going to offset by the full 5 rows as I'm thinking of them. It's going to essentially offset as by 4 rows as we see them. And that'll make a little bit more sense once we actually look at it. I'm going to put a +2 in here. That's going to give me a little bit of extra space in order to put my next title in there and then be able to go after that and paste the content after that. So I'm going to put a +2 in here. And this is simply a trial by error thing. You would notice this if you were making this macro on your own. You would be testing it out and you would see that you need to put another couple of rows in here, and that's how this kind of thing comes about. Then I'll select that cell, and I'm going to put in the title of this particular group of values that I'm going to be placing in here. Okay, so the value I'm going to put in there is the sheet title from that very first sheet in this case. Maybe for good measure, I'll make it bold, make it look nice. All right, so we've put the title in there. Now we're going to have to go back to worksheet 1, or X rather, select it and actually copy the content that we need. So I'm going to start by selecting range A1. It just so happens that I keep all my content starting in cell A1 on that particular worksheet. And I don't know how much content is going to be there, but I want to grab it all. So I'm going to say selection.current region, which we talked about earlier, .copy. And then finally, I'm going to go to the sheets called P and L, select it. So I've selected the sheet I want to be on, but what I want to do is take the active cell. Now remember, the active cell is wherever I just pasted the title there. Okay, and I want to offset 1 row down, select that cell, and then I'm going to say active sheet dot paste. I'm going to finish out my for next loop by putting next X. And finally, it's going to look a little bit funky at the end because it's going to offset by a whole lot the very first time. The very first time it's going to offset by 5 rows plus 2, which is going to look like 7. It's going to look a little bit awkward. So I'm going to grab rows. I only know this because I've done this before. I'm going to grab those rows right there, just a few of them, and I'm going to delete them. That's going to look kind of nice. All right, now if I were building this from scratch, I would probably be stepping into this as I'm building it. So I'm going to go to the step into process so that we can watch all of this happen. So here we go, starting with the very first X, which goes to the first sheet, grabs the sheet title, copies it essentially, or rather stores it in a variable, goes to our P&L sheet, starts from cell A1, offsets by 7, puts in my sheet title there, makes it bold, then goes back to sheet 1, copies all the content here, goes back to my profit and loss, offsets, goes down by 1, and then pastes here, and then goes to the next iteration of this particular process. And if I step into the rest of this and go straight through it, you'll see that at the very end, when I put my last category in there, now I have that big chunk of extra space, those extra rows. And remember I was saying at the very end, I'm going to have that weird little space, and so I'm going to select rows 3 through 6, and I'm going to delete them. And there we go. And they got deleted, everything got moved up, and there's my profit and loss statement. Go ahead and give this a shot on your own, and come on back, and then we'll have a nice big exercise to get a chance to practice everything that we've learned so far. Now that I know how to copy and paste data, I now run into the issue sometimes of having a situation in which my data dump puts data in unpredictable places. For instance, I have a problem here where my data dump delivers some of the content starting in row 5, some of the content starting in row 2, and some of the content starting in row 3. Now eventually I'm going to want to be able to consolidate this all on one last sheet, but I am going to need to learn a few little bits of VBA vocab in order to create a macro that's going to find the content wherever it is on a given sheet. I'm going to start with a sheet called conservative, and I'm in the document called address, call, and end. I am working within the macro. In the module called completed, I am working within the macro called all macros, but that's because I am working on the instructor file. You have a file called utry. And in the utry module, there's an area for you to follow along, and there are little directions in there in the form of comments as well. All right, so I'm going to create a macro whose job it is to travel along any particular column A and start to find the content that's there. It's also going to remember exactly where it found that content so that later on it can grab all that content and then be able to copy it and paste it or move it to another location. I'm going to start by creating a variable that's going to be able to later on contain the content that corresponds to wherever the data starts in my worksheet. So I'm going to call this data start, and I'm going to make this a string variable. That's going to store that cell address. It's a string for now, which will work for me for now. And I'm going to start by selecting cell A1. Just so happens that conveniently enough, my data dump does always start in column A. It's just the row that I'm a little bit unsure on here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what's called the end property. The end property allows me to travel in any particular direction, and it stops when it sees a break in the pattern. So if there's nothing in a certain number of cells, it will travel all the way until it finds something. If it starts in a cell that actually has something and I use the end property, it will then travel in a particular direction until it finds nothing. Okay, so it's following the particular pattern here. And indeed, if I use the immediate window to say the given selection, I want to end, or rather travel in a particular direction. That's what this little bit of vocab does. And I'm going to specify the direction. I'm going to say XL down. The other options that we have are XL up. And then we also have to right or to left. I'm going to use XL down here, and then I'm going to say select, and watch what happens. When I execute that, it travels down to the beginning of my data and actually selects that cell. So that's what the end method allows me to do. And then I want to be able to actually record the address of the particular cell where I ended up there. What's going to allow me to do this is the address method. So I could say selection.address, and let's say I turn this into a question from my immediate window. Watch what happens. It actually tells me what address the cell is that I'm in right now. It does return it as an absolute cell address. That's sort of one of the properties of the address. And once I have done that, now I'll be able to actually store that address in the variable that I've created called data start. And then later on, I'll be able to copy and paste all the content that I want. There are a couple macros already in here that select all the content in the current region, which we've already gone over. And then it also puts in some nice looking headers for me as well. So there are already a couple of macros that are in here that I'm going to use later on. But for now, all I'm going to focus on is creating the macro that's going to find the content wherever it starts. So I'm going to start in range A1 and select it. And then I'm going to say, okay, from the given selection, I want to use the end method to travel down and select whatever cell it finds. Whatever cell it ends up on, I want to store this in my variable. So I'm going to say data start equals the active cell dot address. And then maybe later on somewhere down the line, I want to actually refer to that range, and I'll call it data start. And then maybe I'll select it. This doesn't need to happen right away. It could happen much farther down the line. I have stored this in my variable, so it'll hang on to that until I exit this macro. Now that I've actually found the content that I want, or I think I have, let's test it out to make sure that it's going to work. I'm going to click play, and indeed I end up on cell A5. I'm going to click over here, see if it works again, and there it goes, ending up on A5. If I go to one of my other sheets, I should be able to click on this same button, and it should be able to start on A2. And this one starts on A3. So my macro is working correctly. Now all I got to get it to do is, now that it's actually found the content, I want it to be able to run these other macros here. So copy and paste in A4, and then maybe insert the headers as well. In order to be able to do that, I'm going to need to ask the other macros to run. And what I've done is I've created this parent macro up at the top, whose job it is to run all the other macros that I've designed. And the statement that I'm going to use to call to those macros is called the call statement. So I'm going to say I'm going to call to the macro called find data. your macro is called find your data. Then I'm going to call to copy, paste in A4. Yours is called copy, paste in your A4. And then the third macro I have here is ins headers or insert headers. And once again, yours is called ins your headers. Now that I've created all of these macros and referred to them in one parent macro, all I should have to do is run this parent macro, and it should take care of the whole job for me, and there it goes. Now I've put this handy little button in here, so you should be able to click on the button and it should be able to run those as well. This is what it should look like if it completely works appropriately. Go ahead and give that a shot. And when you're done, come on back. This is a practice video to allow us to rehearse everything that we've learned over the last session. We're going to be creating a report generator, which is going to allow us to basically take all of the macros that we've created already, including this cool sort macro. We saw an example at the very beginning of class of a sort macro. This is an excellent sort macro here. And we also have a macro that inserts columns and rows. We recorded one of those earlier. We also created a macro that inserted some text for us. There's a macro that does all that. And then we also have a macro that's going to format text. We created a macro earlier that did that as well. However, what we're going to be doing in this last example, in this macro called genrep, is creating a report generator, which is what genrep stands for. Now we're going to need to create our for next loop to be able to find a bunch of content and then be able to organize it. We also want our macro to go through each one of the sheets that are in this document, find all the content, move it down a little bit, put in some headers, format those headers nicely. Now I do have macros that already format headers and insert those headers and insert columns above, and it's going to be able to do that on every single one of these sheets. So I am going to need to call to these macros that I've already placed in here, and then I'm going to need to loop those multiple times so that happens on multiple sheets. And then ideally, on the very last sheet, I would love to be able to print out the content from each of those individual sheets and place it directly right here. I'm going to start by declaring a variable that I'm going to be using in my for next statement. So I'm going to call it x, dim x as integer. And I'm going to start my for next statement by saying for x is going to equal 1 to the total number of worksheets, worksheets.count, except for the last one. So I'm going to put my -1 there. All right, and each time it iterates, I want it to select the given worksheet, starting with 1. And it's going to select that worksheet. And then on that worksheet, it's going to sort the content on there, which I have a macro for, and it's called sort last call. I'm also going to have it insert columns and rows, which I have in a macro called ins call row. I also wanted to insert my headers. I have a macro for that called insert text or insert txt. And I want to format the content. I have a macro called fmt txt that will do that. What this is going to do is push all the content on each one of those sheets downward. And so I'm going to have one last cell here that says all portfolios up here, and then the rest of my content is going to start underneath it on each one of those other sheets. So in this case, what I'm going to want it to do is actually copy all that content and place it over here. So I'm going to say on each one of those other sheets, select range B6, and then use a current region. And select that. And then it's going to be copying that for the purpose of coming all the way back to this worksheet and pasting it. So now I'm going to say, go to worksheets called all portfolios. Select the sheet called all portfolios. And then I'm going to use my end property to be able to figure out where the previous content is ending. Okay, so I'm going to paste some content once, And then I don't want the next paste to paste directly over it. So I'm going to use the end property to figure out exactly where the content that I previously pasted, where that ends, wherever that ends. So a lot of folks like to navigate really far down on their worksheet, farther than they will ever go with any pasted content, and then use ElseIF in their end property. And what that is going to do is find the very bottom cell in your worksheet that actually has data populated in it, or rather, the bottom cell in that particular column that you're traveling up in that has content in it. And then maybe I'll use my offset to navigate just a couple cells down, and I'll paste there. And that way I'm not going to be pasting over any content that's already there. So I'm going to start by selecting something really far down. I'll say B2000. And then I'm going to use my end method to travel up, XL up, and select whatever cell that is. Then maybe I'll offset, I'll just move down a couple of rows. That way I'm not pasting over anything. Just 2 rows down. I'm going to select that cell, and then I'm going to put in a little title there. Notice in this case, I'm not actually storing that worksheet name in a variable like we did in the last example. In this case, I'm just saying, hey, that worksheet called such and such, yeah, put its name right here. And we did this in an earlier example. And then I want the word portfolio to follow that. All right, so now that I got the title in here, let's offset a little bit more so we can actually paste some stuff. Offset, maybe a couple more rows. And then we'll paste. Now we are going to have to put our next X in here. This is going to iterate this multiple times over. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to need to do is clean up my columns a little bit because they're going to look a little bit squished together. You probably already know how to auto-fit your columns in regular Excel. Here's how to do it in VBA. You're going to just refer to the columns that you want to choose. In this case, all that content is going to be in B through E. And then it's as easy as saying selection.columns.autofit. I love that method. It's super easy to use. And assuming I don't have any spelling mistakes that I missed while we were going through this, I should be able to execute this, and it should be able to run this for every single one of my sheets and then populate the final result on this particular sheet. And when I press play and choose my genrep or report generator and run it, there it goes. So I have all of my portfolios listed there. And also on all the other sheets in my workbook, I also have my nice titles put in here and formatted. Looks so much better. And there we go. Go ahead and give that a shot yourself and come on back and we'll move on to even more interesting stuff. Welcome back. So we've made this really nice looking macro over here, and it's created a nice little report at the end of our document here, and it has pasted each one of our portfolios. Now, the only thing I would like to improve a little bit is that I have these headers that say conservative portfolios, balanced portfolios, aggressive portfolios, and I do want that to be a little bit more nicely formatted on this final document here. So the last little bit of macro code that we're going to incorporate into this report generator that we've been working on is a little bit of code that is going to format these. Now, this is a good opportunity to play with a new kind of code, which is the find code. So there is a scripting statement that allows us to be able to find certain stuff and then later on we can do something to it, right? So you may have used the find and select or the find and replace tools within Excel, and that's exactly what we're going to be using. We are going to use the macro recorder to do this because, like the sort and filter macros, it happens to record very well. So we're going to start off our little bit of script with some manual scripting, and then we're going to actually create some find script with the macro recorder, and then we're going to finish that out with a little bit more scripting, and then we'll be done. We are done with a file called report generator, so you can go ahead and close out of that file. And now what we need to open is the file called find macros. The file called find macros contains all the exact same code that we've already been working on. And we're just going to add a little extra piece that's going to allow us to find anytime the word portfolio is populated and then formatted a particular way. Now, I'm going to need to put a loop in here so that it can find that word portfolio for every single sheet where it happens, or rather, for every single portfolio that we actually end up pasting here at the end. So I'm going to need to loop it for as many times as that particular word shows up in my spreadsheet. So I am going to need to put a loop in here. And I'm going to need to eventually put in a logical test that is able to end my loop when a particular criteria is met. So the criteria that we're going to incorporate here, we're going to make a do loop. And the criteria that we're going to put in here is we're going to say do loop while the cell that I started on is not the cell that I have ended on. So as you may know, if you've used the find and select tool or the find and replace tool, what it does is it goes looking for something, and then it goes looking for the next thing after that. And so what you can do is you can have it look for every incarnation of a particular word and then get it to format a particular way, and that's what we're going to be doing. But we do want it to eventually end that loop. And so what we're going to say is, okay, I'm going to start on this particular cell. I'm going to find this particular word. And once I actually get back to that first cell again, go through the whole document, cycle back around, come back to the beginning, and land on that cell, that's when the loop should stop. So what I'm going to do is create a variable that's eventually going to be able to house the cell address of my original find. So I'm going to say found cell address. And this is going to be a string so that it can house the cell addresses here. And we'll say that we'll always start in cell B4, maybe. That happens to be the cell where the word all portfolios is showing up right now. And we'll say select that cell. And then we're actually going to store this cell address in our variable. So we'll say found cell address equals active cell address. So active cell dot address, whatever the active cell, in this case is going to be B4, of course, that's going to get stored in my variable. And later on, because it's stored in my variable, I can actually compare it to whatever active cell I'm in at that particular moment to determine whether or not I should continue the loop or not. Let's go ahead and move on. Now, I am going to need some code in here that actually goes finding some things. So in order to do this, I'm going to open up a completely blank document here. Let's put some words in here. Portfolio. Portfolio. So I'm going to put that a couple of times in there. And we should probably do that before we actually try and record our find macro. Otherwise, it's not going to find anything, and that's going to be recorded itself. So let's go ahead and type in those words portfolio. And now I can click on the macro recorder, and here we go. Find test. And I'll click OK. And what I'm going to do is go to the Home tab and find my Find tool. And I'm going to choose Find. And here we go. I'm looking for the word portfolio. I'm going to click on Find Next and Find Next. I clicked on that twice just so I can get a couple of iterations. I wanted to find it the first time, and then I also want it to execute a little bit of code that is Find Next, which you will see in just a second. So I did click that twice, and now I'm going to click on Close, and I'm going to stop recording my macro. And then I'm going to go look at the code. So here we go, going into the module that was just created by my macro recorder in this book 1. And here is your find code. It has 2 different statements here. You have the statement for the very first find, which has all the details about how this find is going to work, where it's going to start, whether it's going to look for casing sensitivity, stuff like that. And then you'll have these statements at the end that say cells.findNext. If you wanted to do this multiple times, you would just say cells.findNext, over and over and over again. Now we're only going to need one because we're going to create a loop to do this over and over and over again. What I want you to do is actually copy all this content, and we're going to put it inside the macro that we are designing. So I'm going back to my main file here, which is the file called find macros. And I'm going to go down into the code that I am designing down here. And I'm going to paste that code that my macro recorder just created. All right, so what my code is going to do so far is store the given cell address that we've already selected in a particular variable, and then it's actually going to activate its very first find. Now, once it actually finds something, I'm going to want it to format it, right? That's the whole point of all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and put in some formatting stuff. I'm going to start my with end with statement. That's going to allow me to only type selection.font once. And now I can just put in all the other statements like name equals Arial. And let's say the size is going to be 14. And maybe we'll make it bold too. That's my whole with statement, so I'm going to say end with. All right, so this is going to format all of my content here. And I'm going to indent that a little bit so it's more visually pleasing for me. Now, I'm going to want to be able to do this every single time. And as soon as it's done formatting, I'm going to want it to then, after this, go and find the next cell. So I'm going to want it to format things and then find the next cell, and then format things and then find the next cell, and then format things and then find the next cell. So what I'm going to do is actually put a do loop around the outside of this, which is going to allow this to iterate multiple times. So here I go, putting in my do loop. Do, and I'm going to use a loop while. And if you remember from earlier, we were saying that we're going to put a clause in here that allows the loop to end when we end up on the cell that we started on. The cell that we started on, that cell address is stored in my found cell address variable. And we'll say that we want to continue looping this while it is not exactly the same cell as the cell that I'm in at that particular moment. So active cell.address. So long as the cell that I started on is not the cell that I'm actually in right now, I want it to keep going. But once it goes all the way to the end, comes all the way back around to the beginning, and lands on the cell that I started on, then I want it to stop. So that's what I'm doing here. And what this is going to do is find every incarnation of that word portfolio that actually shows up and format it. Now let's continue along the same vein that we've been doing for the last few exercises. We do have a genrep macro. And we're going to need that genrep macro to now also call to our macro called for find format portfolio headers. Okay. So after the next X statement, after my genrep macro from our last example, after it calls upon all those different macros and then is able to copy the stuff over there and paste it on this final sheet, after all that is pasted over here, then I want to actually run this little macro that we just created, this find format port headers macro. And so after the next X statement, I'm going to type call find format port. So I'm calling upon find format port headers. And now I should be able to run my genrep macro over here, and it should take care of the whole deal for me. So I'm going to go to my macros and I'm going to say run genrep and click on run. And there it goes. Now I have each one of my portfolios. I have this nice little header right above it. If you want to, I would encourage you to actually go in here and try and change a little bit of the code. So maybe it puts in some red text or something like that instead of this normal black text. But anyway, it worked, right? So that's the end of our report generator session. When you have completed this, come on back and we're going to move on to some very different stuff, including message boxes and receiving end user input. Hello, and welcome back to VBA programming for Excel. At this point, we're going to need to start to be able to communicate to our audience members, or our end users rather, and we're also going to be able to retrieve information back from them. And there are a couple different options that we're going to explore over the next session in order to be able to do this. We're going to be creating some message boxes, and we're also going to be creating some input boxes. Now, let's just start with the basics. A message box is a box that pops up that gives our end user a particular message. This is a really basic message. The standard, the most simple message that you could create, the coding looks like message box or MSG box, and then whatever the words are that you want to say to your end user. You can make some much more complicated messages using the other message box options. If you code your message box like such, where you say message box and then the message is in quotations, and then you follow that with a comma, you can create all different kinds of specific message boxes by using your different VB options. Some examples are the VB yes no box, the VB message box help button, VB OK cancel, VB OK only, VB information, VB yes no cancel, and VB retry cancel. After that, we're going to start looking at some input boxes as well. And this is actually going to allow our end users to be able to type in something. We're going to retrieve that data from these input boxes, and then we're actually going to be able to do something special based on their input. Let's get a couple examples of how these two kinds of input boxes work. I'm just going to open up a completely blank spreadsheet here and open up Visual Basic, and I'm going to insert a module and insert also a procedure in here, and we're going to call this testing 1, 2, 3. And this is going to allow me to be able to test out some of this code. Now, if it's really simple here, I should be able to actually put this code inside of the immediate window. So let's go ahead and test out a really simple message box option. So that's going to say message box, and then maybe it'll say something like, hello world. And once I execute that, now I get this little message box that pops up that says hello world. Now, the way that that box looks is really not determined by Excel at all. It's determined by Windows on my computer. So there I have the simple message box hello world. If I wanted to be able to specify exactly what kind of a box this is going to be, I could say make this a VB yes, no, cancel box. And then I get the message saying hello world, and I have options to click yes and no and cancel. Now at this point, if I clicked yes, it wouldn't matter. If I clicked no, it wouldn't matter. And if I clicked cancel, it wouldn't matter either, because there's nothing that's actually receiving the end user input here. In order to receive end user input, what we're going to have to do is create a variable that's actually going to receive that input. Now, what's interesting is each one of these buttons that's in my dialog boxes, in my little pop-up boxes here, each one of these buttons is actually associated with a digit. It's associated with an integer. And if you wanted to test out and see exactly which integer each one of these buttons is associated with, you could use your immediate window to ask that question. So I could say, what's VB yes associated with? And once I hit enter, it's a 6. It used to be a long time ago that people had to know exactly what the number was associated with each one of these options, and they had to have those memorized. But now we have these thing called constants. VBS is a constant, VB no is a constant, VB cancel is a constant, etc. And these are numerical values that are a little bit more easy to understand for we regular people who don't have all of the integers memorized. So what we can do is test out a little bit of macro code here. I'm going to create a variable that's actually going to receive the end user input from this message box, and then it's going to do something special depending on what their input is there. So maybe I'm going to play a cute little trick on my coworker, and I'm going to say, would you like to download the Sunshine virus? Now, of course, we wouldn't want to do this in a real world situation. Nothing cool about scaring our coworkers and making them think that there's actually a virus. That probably would not be good at all. So I'm going to put in a VB yes, no option for my box here. And maybe I even want to put a title on my box. Maybe I'll say, it's a beautiful day. Okay, so there's my message box. Now, again, like I was saying before, this isn't actually going to receive any end user input. So I'm going to need to put in a variable here that's actually going to receive this input. So input received. I'm going to put in my parentheses around the outside of my dialog. There we go. Okay. And now we can say that input that was received by my message box, whether it's a 6 or whether it is a, let's find out what VB no is. VB no is 7. So we'll say if input received equals 6, then maybe give us a message box that says, go play in the sunshine. Otherwise, we wanted to say, don't work too hard then. And I'll end my end if statement with an end if. And let's test this out. I'll go ahead and run this. And of course, I get this message that says, would you like to download the sunshine virus? Again, we don't want to do this in the real world, but it's kind of a cute idea here. And I'll say, why, yes, I do. I would rather be playing in the sunshine than working hard on this ridiculous spreadsheet all day. And it says, okay, cool. You're all sold. And I'll click OK. Now, if I run it again, but this time I say no, it says, okay, well, don't work too hard then. So I used an if-then statement to be able to do this. And I also received user input from that particular message box that allowed me to do one thing if the answer was 6 and do something else if the answer was not 6. Now, it just so turns out that I don't actually have to test for VB yes to see whether it's 6 or see whether no is 7. I can actually say if input received equals VB yes, so I can write it that way, and that'll work for me too. Yes. Okay. If you haven't done so already, why don't you go ahead and give this a shot? Make yourself a message box that receives user input from the end user. Now, we did create a variable here, and if you want to be extremely careful, which I highly encourage we all do, you could say input received is a integer variable, okay? Because it is receiving that numerical value associated with our constant there. And so it's storing that numerical value. Why don't you go ahead and give that a shot and come on back. Another way to receive end user input is to actually allow them to be able to type whatever they want in a particular dialog box, and then we can receive that input. The kind of dialog box that we're going to use to be able to do this is called an input box. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my input box here. And then for this first example, we're just going to see the input box. So we're not actually going to receive any end user input, but I am going to need a message for my input box. So maybe I'll ask my end users to think about this question here and then be able to type whatever they want. And then after that, I'm going to create some kind of a standard response that's supposed to be applicable in every situation. So I'm just going to type in a question here and my end users can type in their answer. And maybe based on whatever they type in there, we'll say something standard. And if we run this, we'll get this message box that pops up. And regardless of whatever I type in here, we're not actually receiving the response, but this is what it looks like. And my end user can type in whatever they'd like. And then when they click OK, they get this standard response. But maybe we actually want to be able to receive the end user's input and then be able to perform a certain action based on that input. If I want to do that, I'm going to need to do the same thing we did with the message box, which is to create a variable that's supposed to house the end user's input. In this case, my end user is going to type in whatever they want. So I'm going to have to figure out some kind of a variable data type that's going to allow my end users to type in whatever I think that they're going to type in. In this case, maybe we'll say, I think my end users are going to type in text. So I'm going to create a variable that can house some text data. And I'm going to give it a little bit more of a commonly seen VBA variable naming convention, str response. str stands for string. And then the word response is what I actually want to name my variable. So you'll see this all the time, people naming their variables with these 3 letters at the beginning that's supposed to declare what type of a data type is eventually going to be housed in it. And that way it's going to help you remember when you have your list of a ton of variables, exactly which ones house what kind of data. So I'm saying dim str response as string, and then we'll actually use it to receive the input from this input box. So here we go. This variable is going to receive this input, and then maybe we actually want it to perform a certain action. Now, my VBA is getting a little bit specific with me here because it's saying you need to have a more official syntax. So I do need my little parentheses in there. And you could put a title on this particular box if you want to do that too. You just put a comma over here and then put in a title. Just put in something easy. And let's say we'll actually have them name a sheet here. All right. So my end user is going to see this question, what would you like to name this sheet? And then they're going to type in something. It's going to be stored in my variable here. And then I'm going to use my variable to actually name my sheet. So we already know how to do this. I'm just going to say the active sheet that I'm on, and the name of that active sheet is going to be my str response, whatever my end user typed in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. What would you like to name this sheet? This is so cool. Click OK, and there we go. Now my sheet name has been changed. If you haven't done so already, why don't you take a moment to go ahead and test this out. Make sure that you can receive end user input. You will need to create a variable type and then use your input box, which feeds the response from that input box into your variable, and then perform some kind of an action that actually uses that response. Go ahead and give that a shot and come on back, and we'll take a look at a whole lot more dynamic examples next. You may have noticed that in this last example, there were a couple of things that we weren't really able to do. First of all, my code is starting to run over to the right-hand side. I'm running out of space over here. And so eventually I'm going to want to start to use what's called a code continuation character, which allows me to essentially stop coding at that place and then continue my coding on the next line down. Now, normally I wouldn't be able to do that because VBA would say, hey, that's a problem. If I remove my code continuation character, you'll see that VBA is saying, okay, this doesn't look okay here. So I'm going to use what's called a code continuation character. We're going to take a look at that. And the other thing that I want to be able to do is go into my text box and actually make certain text show up on a certain line. So for instance, maybe I wanted to say, hey there. And then on a separate line, I wanted to say, what would you like to name this sheet? If I hit my enter key now, obviously you'll see it's saying you can't do that because again, in this circumstance, I'm having a problem where I'm trying to enter down to the next line, in this case, just within my input box, and VBA is not prepared to be able to do that. And so in this case, I'm going to have to use what's called a vbCrLf constant. And we'll talk about both of these right now. Our first example is the code continuation character. It is an underscore. That underscore does need to be preceded with a space. And so you can kind of think about it like it's always 2 characters. We always have a space and then a underscore. Now, you're not going to be able to do this within a message. So you're going to need to close out the quotations in a message, and then it would really be best just to keep all of your text together and close it out with one final quotation, and then put your code continuation character at the very end. That's the easiest way to do it. And then if we want to actually get our message to go down to the next level, like you see in this example message box here, if we want to continue the code on the next line, you notice this word on is pretty small, so it should be able to fit up here. But we've used this vbCrLf constant, and we have put concatenators on either side of that. And what that allows us to do is basically force a hard return within a line of text. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to take the script that we were using for our input box there, and I'm just going to remove it. We're going to go ahead and put in some example text here. Let's say I'm going to put in a message box, and so I'm going to say, here's my response, but it's going to be an integer, so I'm going to call it int response as integer. And so I'm going to be using this variable to receive the input from my end user, and that's going to come from a message box that says, we'll use our silly little sunshine virus example again. Remember, this is not a real virus, and we don't want to do this in a real situation. Don't want to scare anybody. Like to download the sunshine virus so that I can go play in sunshine. So I'm going to put my comma. Now, normally I would actually put in the VB yes, no here and say what kind of a message box I want this to be, but I'm starting to run out of space and I am not going to be able to see it anymore. So I am putting in a space and then putting in my code continuation character, which is the underscore, and then I can hit my hard return and move down to the next line and keep going over here. So VB yes, no, and we'll put a title here. It's a beautiful day. And that's my whole input box, or rather message box, and that input is being received by my variable. And maybe I'll put in a little if statement here that says if the response is yes, then we want it to say something, and if the response is no, then we want it to say something else. Last time we used an else statement. I'm just going to use a couple if-thens here. So here we go. I'm going to say if int response equals yes, if that's yes, then I'm going to move down to the next line so we can keep it all together. Then we're going to throw up a message box that says, wonderful, go play in the sunshine. However, if they say, no, then don't work too hard. Okay. And of course, if we run this, I'm going to have a problem because I didn't put my end if in there. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my end if. There we go. So it's going to ask, would you like to go play in the sunshine? And I'll say, yes, I would. And it'll say, okay, great, go play in the sunshine. Now let's do it one more time. No, I don't want to play in the sunshine. And it says, okay, don't work too hard though. And I'll click OK. All right, so we used our code continuation character in this example, but what if I want to be able to create a hard return that goes down? So we have this line that says, well done or wonderful, go play in the sunshine. Let's say we want it to say wonderful and then move down to the next line and then say go play in the sunshine. So I'm going to put in my quotation marks to finish out the text wonderful, put in a concatenator character, and then I'm putting in my fancy vbCrLf constant that's going to insert a hard return here, and I'm going to concatenate that with my second line of text. And here we go. Let's check it out. And that's what a hard return looks like when you put it in your VBA code. Take a moment and practice these two tools here. You're going to want to make sure to practice your vbCrLf constant, and you're also going to want to practice your code continuation character. You can use the example that we've done here, and then come on back, and we'll use this in a more realistic setting. So far in this class, we've actually seen if-then statements quite a few times, but we haven't really had a chance to focus on them. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be using the tools that we have been learning over the last couple sections. So we're going to be using input boxes and message boxes and variables, and we're going to be using them with if-then statements to allow particular things to happen if a criteria is met. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to remove all the code that I have in here, and I am still in a completely blank document, and now I have a completely blank procedure here, and we're going to go ahead and start from scratch. Now, the purpose of this particular example is to see a scenario in which I end up coding a little too much using if-thens. And you'll find that a lot of people end up doing this because they want to create a lot of different avenues that are possible given a particular response. But the thing is that if-thens end up creating a whole lot of typing. I end up needing to do a lot of typing. And so after this, we will use the select case statement or structure in order to be able to make that a little bit faster. But for this first example, we're going to go ahead and do this by hand, and it'll be a good practice in using the if-then statements. We have seen if-then-else, and right now we're going to see if-then-ElseIF. So here we go. Let's go ahead and do this. We're going to ask a question that has 7 possible responses, and this is something I like to do in my classes simply for the purpose of giving us a little bit of practice with this. So here we go. So I'm making my variable. That's going to be str response. And then str response, that variable, is going to house the response from an input box. And we'll say which one of Snow White's 7 dwarves is your favorite. And I'll be official here with my syntax, because VBA is going to want me to do that. Okay, so that allows you to put in 7 different answers. That's going to be a whole lot of coding here. I'm going to go ahead and get you started, then we're going to pause, and you can finish out the rest of that code, and then come on back, and we'll learn an even faster way to do it. For now, an if-then statement is going to look like if, and then we'll put in our logical test. So if the response received from my end user is the word grumpy, then maybe we want a message box to pop up that says something specific. So I'm going to put in message box, and you're going to find that your if-then statements start to get a little bit particular. They can get a little bit glitchy, and so there is a particular way that you want to do this. You are going to want to indent the line that says message box here. I know that I've previously said that you shouldn't have to do that, but there are a couple little glitchy things here in Excel's VBA, and this happens to be one of them. Your if-then statements, if you're going to create a lot, you're going to want to indent this next line, the result of your if. So here we go. So if the response is grumpy, then we'll say, I knew you were cool. Or else, we'll ask another question. If the answer is happy, then a particular scenario in which it will give a message appropriate to that answer. All right, so this is the point at which I'm going to pause the video. You're going to want to continue with another line that says else if and create a scenario response for every single possible scenario. So we have grumpy, happy, sneezy, doc, wheezy, sleepy, and dopey, I believe. It's hard to remember, that's why it's one of those riddles. So I'm going to type it over here in Excel, and then you can pause the video. I'm not sure wheezy is actually one of them. All right, well, you can email me and let me know which one I'm forgetting. And now you can pause the video and go ahead and finish out all of your else-if statements until you have created 7 different if-thens. You are going to want to end that with an end if, and then come on back and we'll keep going. All right, so we have all of these different scenarios that we are testing for, and indeed, if we play this and somebody goes ahead and types something in, we will need to make sure that our end user is being pretty case specific, by the way, because I just typed in sleepy, but it was all lowercase and nothing happened. So I'm going to run this again and try it again, but be sensitive to casing, and I'll click OK, and then it says the response that I've actually designed for that particular answer from my end user. You may have noticed a few minutes ago that we used an else statement, so let's take a look at the difference between using else and else if. Using an else if allows us to test for a specific additional response, whereas else is going to be used if we want to create a possible scenario in which somebody might type anything else. So maybe if somebody doesn't type exactly one of the answers above, then I wanted to say, whatever I wanted to say. And that else clause is going to allow me to create a response or an action or a result, given that anybody typed anything that I didn't design using my if-then statements. So why don't you go ahead and give that a shot? Try typing in an else and then test it out. We should be able to run this macro, type in something, and then actually get a response from our else statement. Whereas in the last scenario, before we actually put in this else statement, then if somebody typed in something besides what we were testing for, nothing happened. Now, if somebody types in something that we weren't looking for, then it actually has a result here. Go ahead and give that a shot. You may be feeling like in this last particular scenario that this was a lot of typing, and you would be absolutely correct. A little bit more typing than most coders want to actually have to go through. And so if we're going to have a lot of different potential results from a few tests, it's easier to start using the select case structure. So I'm actually going to remove all of my if-thens, and we're going to go ahead and do this from scratch, but using a slightly more efficient method. So I'm going to keep my variable, and I'm going to keep my inbox, which is actually going to feed a response to the variable. But instead, this time I'm going to say select case, and then I'm going to say str response. Okay, so I am selecting the case of str response. I'm going to provide a lot of different cases, potential cases for str response. So this is basically an if the case is that str is, and then I could say in case 1, it's this, in case 2, it's that, in case 3, it's that, in case 4, it's that, etc. So here I go saying select case, and I'm putting in my variable name there, and then I'm going to say in the case that it is grumpy, and that's pretty much all there is to it. And all I have to do is type in my other cases here. And maybe one more case. And then, if you were curious, yes, there is a case else. This particular else clause doesn't actually need the colon like the last one did. The last one was kind of weird. This one is case else, and then I'll just put for any other case that somebody might type in here, we'll get a message box that says whatever you would like. And then we do need to close out our bookend with a end select statement. And here we go. Running it. And I get the answer of cool. And I'll run it again. And we'll say some gibberish. And that's our select case statement. Why don't you go ahead and give it a shot and come on back. For the next 2 videos, we're going to be using a file called input boxes for sorting. So please go ahead and open up that file. It's called input boxes for sorting, and that's what we're going to be using for the next couple of examples. The next example is going to be the big one. But in order to prepare for that, we're going to need to be able to declare multiple different variables. And if you have to declare 10 variables, you'll find that that is far too much typing. And so what we can start to do is start to declare multiple different variables on the same line. So I'm going to go ahead and declare some variables here. I'm eventually going to be using these in text boxes. So I'm going to make one called message. That's actually going to be the message that my text box reads. And then I will put in a comma, and I can put in the rest of my variables that are all going to be the same data type. So I'm going to have one called message. I'm going to have the one called title bar text for the title bar in that input box. I'm going to have the one called default text for some default text that's going to show up in the input area. I'm going to have one called sort value. That's going to be the particular sort value that somebody could choose by. And these are all going to be string variables. So I'm going to go ahead and declare them all on the same line. This is going to avoid me having to do a bunch of extra typing. So here we go. I'm going to create one called message. I'm going to create one called title bar. Maybe I'll call it title bar txt. I'm going to create one called default txt. one called sort val, and these are all string variables. And with this particular strategy, you can declare multiple different variables on the exact same line. And then I have one more variable that we're going to need to create, which is going to actually be the integer response from an input box or from a message box. It's going to be an input box in this case, but because it's going to be an integer, I'm going to say this particular answer, yes or no, as the answer. This one is going to be an integer, and that's going to need to be on its own line. Using this method, you can declare multiple different variables on the exact same line. Why don't you take a couple seconds to go ahead and type this out? You can even test it out if you would like. You can create an input box that uses all of these fields now by simply filling these fields with a particular value. So I could say the message equals and this way I could test it out. So I've plugged in message there, and now I'm actually going to put an input box here. And maybe I'll use the message as the prompt. And I can go ahead and run this. And indeed, it is using my input that I plugged in there, and it's putting it right there because I'm using my variable in both of those cases. Why don't you take a second to at least declare all of your variables and come on back. We're not actually going to use this second line here, so I'm going to delete it by the time you get back. And when you get back, we're going to continue coding this particular macro. If you've been following along with the videos, I just want to remind you that this little text that we put in at the end of the last little practice session is not actually text I'm going to be using in this macro, so go ahead and remove it. However, we do need our variable declaration here. If you are just tuning in for this video for the very first time, note that we are in a file called input boxes for sorting, and we have needed to declare multiple different variables in order to get started here. Our end goal of this particular macro is to use a sort macro code that's already been created. And you'll see in the macro that's right above the one that we're working on that there's actually a sort macro code that's in there. At the very beginning of this entire course, we did discuss using sort and filter macros and how easy they are to record. So you probably want to record that kind of a macro. And then once you have actually recorded the sort code at least, then you can start putting in some custom scripting. In this case, we're going to be putting in some custom scripting that allows an end user to actually type in what they want to sort by. And this is particularly advantageous because a lot of folks don't know how to sort in Excel. And so it'd be really nice if there was some little box that popped up that said, hey, how do you want to sort? By this option or by that option? They could simply type in which one they want or click on a button, and then the whole sheet gets sorted by exactly what they wanted. So here we are designing a few variables. And we're going to be using these variables in a input box, and I'm just going to use them to temporarily store some text here that is then going to be used by my input box. So this probably wouldn't be necessary in a real world situation unless you were doing this for multiple different inboxes and you wanted to be able to reuse your variable over and over and over again. But in this case, we're only going to be using it once. So not necessarily the most realistic real world example, but it's worth practicing and understanding the concept. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in some text here that's going to be stored in this variable called message. I'm going to say enter a number. We'll have our end users actually type in a number to sort by. And then in one of the previous videos, we learned how to create a hard return inside of an input box. And the way that we did that is with the vbCrLf constant. If you need a little bit of a reminder on this, there is a previous video called the code continuation character and vbCrLf constant. So you can go ahead and take a look at that. If you've been running through the videos straight through, then you probably still remember what that is. Now, the hard part is remembering that we actually need this concatenator to combine whatever text is before it and whatever text is after it. So I'm going to go ahead and put in that concatenator, my ampersand, and I'm going to put in vbCrLf, and then I'm going to put another ampersand after, and I am running out of space here, so I am also going to use my handy code continuation character. Now that's the underscore. I do need a space before it, and that's going to allow me to continue my code on the next line. And I can feel somewhat self-assured that there's not a bunch of other stuff over here because hopefully if I've been true to my own habits in VBA, then I will have put that code continuation character in there every time. All right, so I'm going to continue my text box here. And here are their options. Remember, we've used this hard return, the vbCrLf constant. So we are now moving on to the next line. And here's option 1. If they type in 1, then this will sort by date and time. And then I'm going to put in another hard return there, vbCrLf ampersand, so that they'll get their second option right underneath it. And I am going to put my code continuation character, not that I would need to in this particular circumstance, but it might be nice for me to look at later on when I'm trying to remember exactly what I did with this code. So their second option is going to be by customer, service, rep, and then by date and time. So remember, this is all the text that's being used by my message variable. Let's go ahead and plug in the values for my other variables here. So the other variables that we had to worry about was title bar txt. This is just whatever you want your title bar to say. You could have it say something like sort call center log. That's what our title is going to say. And then in that input box, it is possible for you to put default text that says something like enter 1 or 2, which is going to be helpful for my end user. Why don't you go ahead and catch up with me? Make sure that you have declared all of your variables here and that you have actually plugged in text for each one of these. Now, you are going to be using another couple of variables here in a little bit. We just haven't started using them yet. They are the sort val variable and the yes/no answer variable. Don't worry about those. Let's just start with the message, title bar text, and default text. And when you've done that, come on back and we'll keep going. Continuing with your macro here, you're going to want to actually create this input box, and that input box is going to receive input from the end user, which is going to feed into a variable. And the variable that we have prepared in order to be able to do this is called sort val. So I'm going to say, okay, the sort val variable is the input received from the input box. And the input box is going to use the message as the prompt. You'll see that the word prompt is highlighted in my hint window here. So message is the prompt. And then I've created a variable called title bar txt for the title. And I've created one called default text txt for the default text there. And I'll just go ahead and close that out. So this is my input box. It's going to display my message. It's also going to display the title bar that I programmed here, and it's going to show the default text that we programmed here as well. And the input from that input box is going to be received and stored in the sort val variable. Okay, let's go ahead and make our case structure. So instead of doing my ifs, which are a little bit glitchy and a little bit difficult and can be rather lengthy, I'm going to use the select case structure that we've already learned. And we're going to declare that there's going to be some possible different cases for the value called sort val. So select case, the case that I'm going to be considering is sort val, and now I'm going to provide different potential options for case. I don't actually have to indent here, but I'm doing it to make it more easy for me to see. So we're going to say if the case is 1, so if my end user actually types in the string value of 1, then we want to call the macro called date, then time. And it just so happens that there's already a macro created and stored in this particular file called date, then time. And we'll provide a second case here. If my end user actually types in 2, that means that they want to see the representative and then date and then time. There's a macro that we've made for that, and it's called rep sort. If they type in anything else, then we want them to get another message that says, hey, you didn't really type in the right thing. Do you want to try again? So I'm going to put in a case else, which we learned a couple videos ago. So case else, and then in the case that they type in something besides 1 and 2, then we want a message box to pop up that says, hey, you didn't type 1 or 2. Do you want to try again? And we're actually going to store whatever they choose, yes or no. Yes, I want to try again, or no, I don't. Those are integer values, right? Because that's going to be a VB yes, no, because that's going to be a message box. Because those are integer values, I'm going to need to store it in a variable. Good thing is we've already created a variable called yn answer, and that is an integer variable. So let's go ahead and use that one. Yn answer is going to receive the input from my message box that's going to say, hey, you Didn't type 1 or 2. Do you want to try again? And we'll give the options of yes or no. And then maybe we'll make a little simple if statement here that says if the variable yn answer, if my end user actually typed in yes, then we want it to start this all over by calling this macro that we're creating right now. It's just going to rerun this macro, so it's going to call the sort by macro. So it's going to start it over from the beginning. And then I'm going to need to put in my end if, because we do need that closing statement. I'm not going to put another clause for if the VB answer is no, because I pretty much want it to be like, if they choose no, then nothing happens, right? And that's exactly what's going to happen in this case, as we learned much easier in one of the earlier videos where we saw if-then statements with no else. If there's no else and somebody actually clicks no, then nothing happens, okay? So I'm putting in my bookend there that says end if, and then of course I do need to close out my bookend that is my select statement, so I'm going to say end select. And with that, I should be all done, and here we go. Let's check it out. So we'll go ahead and play it, and then we have the option to sort by date and time, or by customer service rep and date and time. And I could enter in the value of 1, and then it actually sorts by that particular order. Or I could sort by 2, and then it sorts by that order. Now, it just so turns out that my data over here actually isn't sorted in any other order. So you can test this out by resorting it by some other order, and then test it out one more time. 1, and there it goes. Now you can actually see it happening. Now, if somebody types something else, you should get a message that says you didn't type 1 or 2. Would you like to try again? And if you click yes, it should run this entire process over again. So I'm clicking yes, and there we go. It worked. Go ahead and test this out for yourself. Make sure that your entire macro works. And if you're wondering whether it's working or not, you can come back and take a look at my code right here. And when you're all done, come on back and we'll keep going.